I'd like to talk about this odd-looking watch. It's not something I ever thought I would get because it has two things that I'm not really a fan of. It's gold-plated and it has a redial or a modified dial. But before I get to the details on that, I just want to talk about the history of the movement behind it and how it fits into Seiko history. Now this is a 1969 King Seiko 4500 movement, and it has a lot of really interesting bits about its history that I'd like to discuss before we get into the dial. Now, as I said in the prior video, by the 1960s, Seiko was really set on competing in the highest level possible as far as watch accuracy. And by the 60s, they had divided their two main factories, their Dani and their Suwa factory, and made sure that they were independent and they were competing. The Suwa factory created the Grand Seiko line, and the Dani factory created the King Seiko line, of which this is an example. Now, for the most part, historically, Grand Seiko is viewed to be substantially superior to King Seiko, and for the most part, it's true, but the early King Seiko movements really did give Grand Seiko a run for its money in many ways. So, just a brief history. The first movement that King Seiko made in the early 60s was what became known as the 44 caliber. It was released in various versions. There were different cases, but the movement was basically the same. And it culminated with the chronometer grade 44 King Seiko that was released in the mid-60s. That is to this day valued and respected highly by Grand Seiko collectors, and it's thought to be the only true equal to Grand Seiko watches of the same time period. And so good was the 44 movement in this King Seiko that Grand Seiko ended up borrowing it for their 4420 line. So for the first movement for King Seiko's line, they did pretty good. But this was a low beat movement, as you can tell, especially in comparison to this. And as Seiko was competing in the 60s in the astronomical observatory competitions, things like that, they were motivated to move up the frequency or beat rate of the watch because you can get higher accuracy. And this is what we have here. This is the 4500 movement that was released in about 1968. This is from the second year release in 1969. And it was released as a 4500, a 4502 with a date. There was the next level up was a officially certified chronometer, which, like I said from the prior video, since it was the late 60s, it would have been certified by the Japanese branch of the Swiss Bureau of Observation. Then you had something interesting happen. Once again, Suwa's Grand Seiko line ended up adopting the 4500 movement, and they started using it in some of their watches, much like the 44 before, because it had demonstrated that it can be very accurate. Now, it didn't stop there. In 1968, Seiko took 103 of their Grand Seiko 4500, or as they were called, 4520 movements, did some modifications to them, and entered them into the, I believe it's called Neuchâtel Astronomical Observatory competition. And 73 of them ended up being certified as astronomical observatory chronometers, which is an amazing feat because that standard is much higher than the regular certified chronometer feat. So the long and short of it is the first two movements, the 44 and the 4500 for King Seiko, were extremely impressive enough to be Grand Seikos and impressive enough to be even astronomical chronometers. So it's with that background that I get into this watch. I had wanted one for a while, and I definitely wanted a stainless steel one, but I stumbled upon this one, and it really took me aback, and I started researching, and I discovered there's basically no information available on this watch. So I asked around and looked at the pictures carefully. I found that a stainless steel version of this had sold on a used watch shop in Japan a while ago, and I'll pull up the picture here. As you can see, the dial is the same, except there the case has been polished to death and basically obliterated, but the dial is the same. So I thought about it, and I took the risk and I bought it. And when I finally got it, I disassembled everything because I was worried about the state of things. Because again, when these things are disassembled, there's no guarantee that it's a competent person who's taking care of things, and it may very well likely not be. But what I discovered when I opened it up was the movement was really clean. It was actually serviced a few years ago, unbeknownst to the seller. And it was in really good condition, because one of the possibilities was that the dial on this was damaged with water or something, or mold or something like that, as a lot of these King Seikos tend to be, and someone decided to simply redo the dial. But no, that isn't the case, because I have encountered 2 of these. I've met someone who's encountered a few more. So there's strong evidence that this was a serial production. There's no evidence that Seiko themselves did it. But my working theory is that a Japanese jeweler, or a jewelry store, watch store, presumably near around the time when these were new, in 69, 70, offered as an option to have the dials modified with this particular print, and you had to pay more for it. Because the other thing I noticed when I disassembled it is the print is impeccably done. There is absolutely no indication that this is a garage job, that this is a ham-handed redial effort like typically what you see in most older watches with redials. The thing is, someone had to remove the hour markers, remove the Seiko mark, the KS mark. Those are welded on to the back, and then they presumably did some sort of printing. And if you look carefully at the dial, look at the texture that it has. It's really absolutely amazing the kind of detail that is put in. And after they were finished with everything, they reapplied all the indices and presumably had to re-weld them. I've not disassembled the watch yet, so I've not seen the back of the dial, but everything is done really cleanly. And presumably the print obliterated the high beat print that would have been under the KS and the movement case designation that you would see at 6 o'clock. So that's really the story of the dial. Now, the meaning behind it is, it's actually a pretty famous Japanese artist's image by the name of Utamaro Kitagawa. It's thought this particular image was produced in 1798, I believe. And the full name for it is Young Woman Blowing Up Poppin'. It's a glass noisemaker, so presumably this is meant to have been something for a celebration. And if I recall correctly, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York here has this in their permanent collection, though it's currently not in display. So that's how we got what we got. And I'll try to bring it closer to you. And just, I know the aesthetic is not for everyone, but if nothing else, I'd like to think others could perhaps appreciate the fine detail put into this dial, because it's just like nothing else I've ever seen, aside from the other versions that have the same dial. And I think in this case, this may be a redial or a dial modification, but it's done so well, and I'd like to say so tastefully well, that it really is forgivable. And again, look at the edge as you go around. There's just no indication that this was an amateur job. It's all so clean, and when you look at the dial, when you take it out of the case, edges are clean. It's just amazing. And I don't quite know how they did that texture, but it's just absolutely wonderful. Now, there's one little drawback, though. Now, aside from the individual minute markers being gone, the hashtags for it, which isn't really a big deal. But the one thing, let me pull up the original image again from the artist Kitagawa. Now, if you look here on her right shoulder on the kimono, you'll see that the flowers and the red checker pattern is a bit faded. Now, the other watch that has the same dial has the same exact flaw. And again, if you look at the Kitagawa original here, that's all even. So presumably that was some sort of flaw in the printmaking. But it's not really, again, given that this is from 1969 and I'm going under the assumption that this is roughly when the dial was modified, it doesn't really bother me as it adds to the sort of aged look to it. And I guess thinking about it some more, the other main reason why this appealed to me so much was when I first got interested in JDM watches, when it was still a lot more difficult to get into Yahoo Auctions Japan. It was always such a trophy to get a watch that had a Japanese day in the calendar. It really meant that you were able to break through and get something that wasn't really meant for the outside Western market. And I guess I still have that mindset to this day. So when I saw this dial with this particular image, which is such a Japanese image, this, I imagine, is for the most part not something that would really appeal to Westerners, as it's a very culturally Japanese thing. It just made it extra special, even more so than just getting a Japanese day wheel. It's just something that you're just not going to find outside of Japan. And you throw in the fact that the movement is really high grade, has a wonderful history, and I got lucky in that this was actually serviced. And I really do want to emphasize, with the 36,000 beat per hour movements, servicing really does become an issue because they do tend to wear out quickly. I am just really, really pleased. I've never really worn gold anything in my life, but it's just really wonderful, and it gives me a lot of pleasure. Again, just for t-shirt short wearing, it's a bit weird, but I think I'm willing to sacrifice and wear it as is. Other thing to mention is oftentimes on the gold plate versions of these, because gold is soft, and I don't know the extent of the plating, but you tend to find the crowns being worn down because the 4500 is a manual wind only. You have to wind the crown, and oftentimes the ridges are completely worn down. This is in reasonably good shape, and this watch was, what can I say, pretty well taken care of in its life. I definitely want to keep an eye out on spare crown, not that they're the easiest to find, but that's really the other thing. But normally, aside from that, obviously I usually go for stainless steel, but this option was available only in gold, so I just thought it was a worthwhile thing. And if you can see on the case back here, it says SGP back. That SGP stands for Seiko gold plate. And again, some more angles. I should probably get a brown strap of some sort, as that would probably match the gold more, but really nice, really minimal tarnish. And I just I can't stop looking at the details of the dial. It's just so nice. And to some extent, I think it probably works better with the gold than in the silver, as there's a bit less of contrast going on. But that's really it. And just because there's no information available on this, I thought it would be worthwhile to have some record out there in case anyone ever takes any interest in it or happens to be looking for it. I can definitely vouch for the quality. And that's about it for this video, and as usual, thanks for watching.